long-term plans, so the issues that Nicole particularly is going to lead us through a wee bit later is actually really, really important. So, but I better do the appropriate stuff first. So if I could just refer you to our agenda. Do we have any apologies that we should just note? Mayor Gary around? Is he around today?
He's here. He's coming.
Can we just note lateness for Mayor Gary? Is anybody else? Well, I'll just move that we sustain that lateness. And I'll have a second, please. Thanks, Abel. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, it's carried. Thank you very much. It's not been informed of any leaves of absence, so we'll deal with that. Conflicts of interest. Anybody have a clear conflict of interest? No, just second rates. Okay, that's cool. I don't believe that's actually the case. Maybe different later on. I haven't had any notification of members of the public wishing to speak, nor do we have any extra or urgent items that aren't already on the agenda. Can I then please ask us to move to check? I'm on page 11 of our agenda, which is the minutes of the open minutes of our meeting on the. G'day, Gary. How are you?
Apologies, Mr. Chairman.
Not a problem at all. That's great to see you. Our meeting on the 11th of September. I'd like to move from the chair that we accept these as a fair record. Thank you, Paul. Is there any items of correction or point that needs to be raised at this stage? There isn't. I'll put the motion in. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against? It's carried. Brilliant. Okay. Well, that gets us to the real game in town. My agenda is correct, Nicole.
Yep.
I think we're directly in your hands. It'd be the quickest way to get into this and do it right.
Yeah, I just thought I'd just take the opportunity at the start of the meeting just to recap some of the process that we've been through over the last sort of 6 to 9 months and just remind you about how we got here. Sometimes when we went through the process it wasn't really clear that we were going to end up at this point with this document, but that was the intention of all the work that we've been doing. So I've just got a few slides that I'm just going to whip through just to remind you in terms of where we're at. So what we're here to do today is to talk about the revenue and financing policy, and so that's the document that really talks about how we're going to fund our activities and what sources of funding we're going to use. That actually supports the Council's financial strategy. So the financial strategy lays that foundation of financial management for Council and what we're trying to achieve financially. And that strategy also sets some controls around limits on rates and debt. And that in this revenue and financing policy that we're talking about today is to operate within that context, okay? So it enables us to achieve what we want to achieve financially through the funding mechanisms that we're looking at through debt, through rates, plus through other funding tools. So you'll see in the policy that we've been through a process to think about what we think are the appropriate ways to fund the activities of Council, and in deciding about which tools we're going to use. And those tools are on the left there. They're the general rates, targeted rates, grants and subsidies, fees and charges, interest and dividends, borrowing, and other sources like asset sales or lump sums or development and financial contributions. And so we make decisions about what we think are the most appropriate ways to fund our activities with those tools. We've got a set of things that we need to think about when we're making those decisions, which we'll talk about on the next slide. When it comes to general rates and targeted rates, we then think about, in this policy, how will that general rate be set? Is it going to be set on capital or land value differentials in the UAGC? And we don't do it in this policy, but we also then think about in our long-term plan, if we're going to use a targeted rate, how we're going to set that? Who's going to pay it? What basis it's going to be set? So it's sort of taking from the strategy through to the policy, through to how that rolls out in terms of what actually ends up on someone's rate statement. So when we make these decisions, we have to, like I said, think about what we think are the appropriate sources of funding. So we have that section, what's referred to in the report as 1013A and B. And so for each activity we have to consider our outcomes and our objectives, and we have to think about whether the funding, the proposed funding method we're going to use actually supports the achievement of those objectives. We have to think about the distribution of benefits between the community as a whole, or parts of the community, or individuals when we're thinking about who should be paying or what sort of funding tool we might use. The period over benefits occur in terms of if it's a long time we might use some borrowing, or we might look at some development contributions, something like to fund those longer term benefits. the extent to which actions or inactions of some contribute to that need. So that might be, you know, if there's a person driving along the road and they throw some rubbish out the window, we might want to try and charge them to recover and get rid of that rubbish and fix that. That's a cost of the activity. And we use that particularly in our roading rate model to target some of the costs of roading to those heavy traffic users. And then also the costs and benefits of separately funding the activity for transparency and accountability. So that's really where we think, given the scale or the community's interest in the activity, we actually want to fund that separately and potentially show it separately, and that can be through our LTP, or it can be also in our rate statement, you know, that we're actually identifying that so they can sort of see it, because we want to have an element of higher level of transparency around that. Once we do those things, so that gets us to the point we've thought about, okay, when it comes to roading, what tools are we going to fund this activity by? And then we do that for all of our activities, we add that all up, and then we need to step back from that and think about actually what's the impact of all of that, those funding mechanisms on our community, and are we happy with those decisions that we've made in terms of the impact that's going to have on well-being. It could be on affordability, of, you know, ability of people to pay those rates, and we might adjust as a result. So in this process, to an extent, we've actually done a little bit of step 2 consideration in some parts of these activities, particularly around, you'll see in the report about jetties on Stewart Island. So we've done a little bit of that, knowing that we've got particular communities who might struggle a little bit, and so we've made some adjustments now. And we also then need to probably do that again when we've got our LTP budgets finished and make sure that we're all good. Okay?
Nicole, I just wonder if I can interrupt you.
Yeah.
I do think, I'm asking this as a question, but it sounds like a statement. But my presumption is that the steps and the way they're numbered are important. Okay, the Act requires step 1 is undertaken first, so it's arguing for a principal consideration of your mechanisms for funding in the first instance.
Yeah.
That's the first port. Then you think about step 2, which is the overall allocation and its consequences, rather than potentially starting the other way around. Albeit we'll always have a strong sense of what is the other way around.
And one thing that came through the Productivity Commission's report as well is that councils, when they do step 2, probably aren't communicating that well about what they're doing in step 2 and how they're adjusting their original decisions. So we've also tried to do that a bit better in the policy now in terms of showing that transition and why we might be changing things. Okay. Oh, and that was your subjective judgment there in step 2, which I've handed along to you along the process. So yeah. So just in terms of what does that look like at the moment, so we started out the process where our general rates make up about 24% of our revenue sources, or 17.6 million. We take quite a lot of targeted rates, around 41%. Most of that's the roading rate, that's included in that. Grants and subsidies make up about 23%, fees and charges 8%, and those other items about 4%. So we are quite rate heavy. Okay, so the aim of our process for this review of the policy for our policy for revenue and financing policy was we really wanted a targeted review. We didn't do a wholesale review of everything. We knew there were some areas that we wanted to look at, so we've focused on those, and we've also worked on articulating our policy story and logic and the rationale for our funding decisions. So we identified those areas, so that was really around local activities. We looked at the roading rate again, we looked at the way we fund water and wastewater, we looked at waste management, environmental services, and we also talked a little bit about the general rate, how do we make that up, and the basis that we use for that. And so we've workshopped a lot of that with you guys as elected members and worked through those discussion points to get to the point where we are today. And we've developed work papers for those workshops to seek your guidance on the matters that we were looking at. And we've prepared the policy based on those discussions. We've also sought that feedback from the community in terms of the community boards for the majority of the local rating changes that we're talking about. And we're looking to confirm that approach for the LTP that we're preparing. So that basically when we put that document together, we're quite firm at the moment on the way we wanted to do, particularly the local rating and the rating side of things, but like I said, we might need to come back and review if there's some budget changes that have quite a big impact. And if we do need to do that, we'll probably do that concurrently with the LTP when that's out for consultation. So the outcomes that we were really looking for from this review process was it's really a limited overall change in policy direction. It's around really adding a few specific funding tools and funding proportions tweaked for each of the activities. And the main change has been around how those local activities are funded. We've also made sure that there still is an element of flexibility in the policy. The policy, you can't vary from your policy. Your policy must allow you to use that funding tool. And if you go outside the limits in there, you have to then go through a separate process, or you have to have a resolution of council to say that you're okay to do that. So we do need an element of flexibility in here as well. So I'm going to delve back into the local activity funding review, because that's really where we've done most of our changes, and just reflect back on all of that, particularly for Bruce, because he hasn't been a big part of the process as well. So when we've done this review, we really wanted to reflect on the legislative considerations, particularly around benefit, distribution, benefit, transparency and accountability, and council's overall objectives. We've been looking to address inconsistencies in the way that we rate and simplify, reflect our new representation structure, and also think about our vision. And throughout this process, we've always kept in mind that it's never actually going to be a perfect user-paid system. It's a rating as a property-based taxation model. So there's no right answer, and you guys have the subjective judgment about what feels right and what's appropriate based on the considerations that we go through in terms of that legislation. So this map was just a reminder of what our current approach for funding these local activities is, and so we've got a mixture of community board and CDA rating with the yellow and the green in the map, and we're funding these activities from these yellow and green areas, and also the ward areas which aren't shown on that map. And so that means, there's a bit of inconsistency in who's paying for some of these activities in terms of how that's made up. So when we've looked at a new model, what we've been doing is we've talked to the community boards. So we've gone out to understand with them the benefit, who they believe benefits from the activities they provide. Is there anybody creating costs for them? So we've talked about the nature of those benefits, whether it's the whole community, parts of the community, individuals, who might be expected to contribute to those costs as a result, and how maybe they should pay. And you'll remember we got this back where we had feedback from them in terms of there was general agreement that the whole community benefits from those things on the left. Local representation of in stormwater, footpaths, playgrounds, parks and reserve beautification, but there was some things in there around for some of those services the nature of the benefit isn't equal. Some of them have easier access to services, and therefore they have a slightly better, a higher benefit than those people who potentially live further away, or it's more difficult for them to access those things. Parts of the community was really the perception there with the boards when we were talking about was really they might not have that service operated by council in their area. So the nature of the benefit was only certain parts of the community that have that thing get that benefit. And then individuals was particularly in relation to Stewart Island about being able to connect and use that service. And we talked a little bit about funding of those things, and based on the nature of those benefits and the discussion of the whole of community benefit, several activities were identified. Actually, the benefit of those is more district-wide rather than in the local communities. The levels of service are very similar. It's very consistent about what's provided, and those things should be funded at a district level rather than a local level. So those are the ones in the orange boxes. So when we reflect back on how we do it at the moment, so as you know, we've got differences in who's paying for the same type of activities in different parts of the district, and that's driven by those variations in community board and CDA rating areas, whether they use differentials, some do and some don't, and also the variation in the ward contributions. And so those differences existed even though we had a lot of agreement about the nature of the benefits. So that was an issue that we wanted to fix. So what did we do? So the process we've followed is we've discussed with those community boards around those options that we've developed. So we discussed with council some options. So that was around funding the activities across the district within community boards with differentials, and as a result of that we identified some preferences. And so those preferences were really for footpaths, parks, playgrounds, funding those by a community board rate, and saying that in the community board area there are some areas that are more urban that have footpaths that give a high level of access, so they should pay a full charge, versus rural, they don't have the same level of access, so they shouldn't pay as much, and we had a differential of a quarter charge for those. Okay, and that was to reflect those differences in levels of service, choices by the boards about what they do or don't provide in the area and to what extent. Funding for halls and pools remained unchanged. Funding for CIASA, that came back in terms of we wanted to look at the addition of a local rate funding tool, really to address the sustainability of that supply. Funding for Stewart Island Jetty's component of water structures, that was also around the addition of a general rate funding method in there in terms of helping with the sustainability of that service and also to reflect the benefit that's provided by jetties. And then funding local representation cemeteries and litter bins were across the district through a general rate, and that was largely because those activities have more of an equal benefit across everyone. And stormwater was across the district with a differential for serviced and unserviced areas. So those areas that have a stormwater system would pay a higher rate, and those parts of the district that don't have the same level of access would pay a lower rate. And that was so that was really around that difference in availability. So we discussed that proposal with community boards, and the feedback from them was that they were overall supportive of that. They were concerned about the definition of all communities being urban, and some smaller communities with smaller populations and smaller infrastructure. So as a result, we've developed that semi-urban category of which is a 0.5 or a half charge. Okay, so we've got a tiered structure for a community board rate. If you've got everything and you're a bigger community, you'll pay a 1. If you've got some things, maybe a bit smaller, you'll pay a 0.5. And if you've got hardly any of the services that a board would provide and you're rural, then a 0.25 charge. So everybody's contributed, which goes back to the feedback we have that everybody gets a benefit, but the nature of the benefit is different depending on how far away you are. That's where we landed. So that rolled out in terms of footpaths, parks, playgrounds, mowing, street lights is going to be funded by a community board rate. So there's 9 community board rates, and they're going to have a differential of an urban, semi-urban and rural. And that varies, so the amount varies depending on the board. Stormwater is going to be funded across the district, so that's a new stormwater rate, and that's going to have a differential for serviced and unserviced properties. And so if you're serviced, it's $46, and if you're unserviced, it's $12. And these numbers are based on the current budgets, which will need to be updated for the LTP once those budgets are finalised. Local representation, cemeteries and litter bins, again, equal benefit for everybody to be able to access these things. And so therefore funded by everybody at the same level on a fixed amount. And so that equates to $17 for local representation, $5 for cemeteries and $16 for litter bins. So that's what we've built into the policy. So we've physically changed the categories of funding mechanisms to enable these categories to apply to the activities as you see them in the policy. And this is the horrible table that just shows you what the impact of that is. So I don't think my pointer's working. So it's the community board, the area, how they've been classified in terms of the differential, whether they're urban or serviced or rural and unserviced, what differentials applied, what their new community board rate will be, what their current community board rate is in the grey, what their revised community board rate will be when we take out the litter bins and the cemeteries and the local representation. So that's the equivalent apples with apples. Not apples with apples, that's the equivalent rate for the community board rate, and then we add back in the general rate components that we're doing for litter bins and cemeteries, plus stormwater, and then the dark blue column gets us to our revised rate. So you can see for Balfour, they currently were paying $219. Under this revised model, the apples with apples comparison is 184, and then we've got to add representation on top because it wasn't included, and we get to 201. So they're going from 219 to 201. So that table there demonstrates the movement that's occurring throughout that process. Great. Okay, so so that pretty much, I'm going to just whiz back to the report and just check where I'm at. So that takes us through paragraphs 36, 37, 38, and 39 through to 45 in the report. So I don't know.
I wonder if
you want me to
at
pause?
this point perhaps I sense when I see CS that I recognise there are some, if I've understood it correctly, some different considerations for the remainder. So what we've had to date is something which if I picked up correctly, has gone through a reasonable process of policy development, thinking with the community board or consultation with the community board, and has received a level of direction from council today.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that before we deal with Siasa and I assume Tiana Airport, and whoever else is on that list, it might be useful if we just open it up for questions at this point or comments. And to go back to it, as you quite rightly said to me, Nicole, we're looking at effectively paragraph 36, which is on page 26 of the report through, I'll get this right, help me here, it's going to be the paragraph 45. So are there any comments folk would like to make? Would you like me to go through each of those paragraphs, paragraph by paragraph? Paul?
Just one wee point, 43, I think there's a mistake with Tuatapere and Waihapai Toitoi. The semi-urban, it's got it down to $9.
Oh, sorry, that'll be an error by me. Yeah. I'll tell you what it is.
So why don't I just take it sort of rate by rate, just in case there's any final thoughts you folk want to. So the paragraph 36 says the local representation. My reading is this moves into general rate. Any comments or questions folk would like to raise about that at this stage? No? Let's move on to cemeteries. Absolute necessity for us old people. Probably a risky joke, isn't it? Sorry. Okay, let's keep going.
So just remind me, we've got two types of cemeteries. We've got council-owned cemeteries and we've got trust-owned cemeteries.
Yeah. Yeah.
How does this rating impact on the provision for trust-owned cemeteries?
Yeah, so we had quite a long conversation with some of the boards and councillors, I think you remember, in the room around trust-owned cemeteries. And the concern is that those communities who live in areas, in a community board area that only have trust cemeteries will, under this model, be paying the $5 for cemeteries across the district. And on discussion with council, we sort of realised that actually when you think about cemeteries, just because you've got a cemetery in your local area doesn't necessarily mean that's the cemetery you are going to use or your family are, or any of those sorts of things. So on that basis, cemeteries were more about availability for the whole district, not just the ones you've got in your community board area and they're the only ones you should pay for. So, and we reflect on the fact that the nature of how people, where families live, isn't necessarily in the same community where that cemetery is and where their family might be interred. They're going to travel more frequently. So on that basis, we felt that cemeteries were more of a district-wide activity rather than a local activity. People are likely to travel throughout the district and use those services. There was also the element of the cemetery records, and that's that service being available for historical family research as well. So that aspect, that it's not just those areas. So it was on that basis that council felt that whilst there were some areas that just had trust-run cemeteries, on the whole the benefit was realistically for the whole community, and on that basis they'd be funded across the whole area. We did also talk a little bit about the future of those trust cemeteries and what might happen, with those, and some of the members that are involved in running those, and whether in the future they may actually become part of council's operations. And some of that has occurred in some areas. So yeah, it was quite a long discussion, but on balance, given the amount of money and the fact that the benefit isn't necessarily just local, people use cemeteries everywhere and people from outside of Southland come here, we settled on the fact that we can fund them across the district.
Thank you. Any other question on that, John?
No, and I think it would open up a conversation if it was a trust cemetery, do they want to remain a trust, or because they're paying council, maybe they consider becoming part of the council of cemeteries. That's fine.
Thank you. So if I then move to paragraph 38, which is open spaces, which I think is essentially the ribbons, if I've read the paragraph correctly. Again, this is one that is moving the general rate. Any questions about that? No? So I move to stormwater. So again, a change, but in this case, not general rate, but to a differentiated, if I've got it right, targeted rate. Which makes sense, and I think without repeating, Nicole reflects that some have a greater level of service in the community than others, and that's what the differentiation is all about. Any questions as far as that's concerned? Yes, Don?
As far So that stormwater rate, is that moving from a local funded activity to a district-wide activity? And does that mean that the community will have less of a say, or community will have less of a say on how that is implemented in their district? Is there an effect?
Good question to Nicole.
Yeah, and this is something that came up at the community board meetings as well, as if it moves from funding decisions being made by the board, what does that mean in terms of input that they would have? And so we've been through quite a process with Matt's team as well to differentiate that actually boards still have a role to play in terms of providing input, and information into the process that can be used by the council staff when developing the programs around what's proposed for stormwater. So the intention wasn't to not have those conversations with them anymore, it was just simply that the funding mechanism was going to come across the district. So the intention is to still, just like we do when we're doing decisions about toilets or things like that are currently district funded, we come and talk to them about what they've got in their area and what we're proposing to do and get their input. They just don't have that setting of the budget and setting of the rate part of the process. Would that be fair, Matt?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Nicole. I guess the only comment I'd add to that is ultimately that's council's decision how they wish to delegate to committees and subcommittees the role and responsibilities for governance of any activity. So if the council wishes to include the individual local communities in the decision making and governance responsibilities associated with providing individual stormwater networks, then it's council's prerogative to do so. However, there is an operational efficiency and management implication for those decisions which needs to be assessed on balance.
Yes, Don, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I feel that the water moving through a district and through a community, it's a pretty important aspect of a community. I wonder if perhaps that's something that needs to be considered, the local input into how the water moves through their area.
Yeah, but Gary, would like you're about to.
Oh, I was just saying, we don't know what the Three Waters for the future is going to bring either within environmental considerations through government. So, yeah, I don't know if that will be taken off us in the future, but I certainly agree with Councillor Byers that we need to have that community input.
So that does suggest here that we're not. I was about to say we're conflating two issues. I don't think we are. They are related. I agree, but is this a reasonable basis on which to charge for an activity versus how does the relatively new board structure work in terms of delegation of responsibility and decision-making rights, which and you're saying, Matt, quite correctly, is a decision of this council to make its mind up on. Since what you're saying, Don, you hope that there is reasonably strong input by community board into the issue of stormwater. Correct.
Yes, that's right.
Does that affect your view on the rating? Because our issue this afternoon is this a reasonable basis on which to charge for an activity called stormwater?
If it was just that charging the way it was charged across the district and nothing else changed, except that rating aspect, then that would be fine.
Yep.
But because there's an element where there's a loss of control for a community board, then that sort of clouds this issue a wee bit.
Well, I don't know if it's been established that they've got a loss of control. I think it's the point. My point I'm trying to make is that we're dealing here with what is an effective mechanism to charge, not necessarily whether there is another impact in terms of decision-making rights by a community board. Okay. Anybody else here want to help me? Yes, Paul?
Oh, I just think in that case, like stormwater is a highly visible activity, especially when it rains a lot. So I think the two can be separated to some extent. I'm I'm sure community boards will be discussing stormwater if they saw flooding on corners or whatever.
Right.
So I don't think it's that dangerous. So that's a big issue.
I feel like it's a good point that you've raised on, but I feel like it's a slightly different conversation for a different place, which is actually how our decisions made at a community board level and over what. I still would want to guide the committee by saying the critical question here is, does this make sense in terms of actually a mechanism where you are trying to relate the activity, which is called stormwater, as the way in which we recover the costs associated with that activity. Going back to the point that you quite rightly raised on as a differentiated district-wide targeted rate. Okay? Let's get going. Community board rate. Now this takes up, I think, the balance of the paragraphs we're considering, which is a differentiated targeted rate is what is being proposed. There's any questions here for Nicole or anybody else? Are we okay?
It's not a question, it's really it's good to see the number 3 categories, and as a result of that discussion with the community boards, that there's positive support for that complex.
The ME7, ME rural. Yeah. Okay.
It's a lot of mirror.
It makes it less of a blunt instrument. Yeah. I think
It's fair. It's fair.
it's fair. Good. Julie?
Yes, it's good to see. It's easy to understand how that's been reached, and it's consistent across the board, which is really important.
Right.
The boards, as well as Lucky. Just for Paul asked the question before about the Tuatapere and Te Wairau.
Yeah, and I've got that wrong.
So the semi.
Yeah, it should have an 8 on the end of it.
Oh, should be 89.
Should be 98.
90.
So they're both 196, 98, and they're actually 49. Late night typing.
It's not $9.80.
That's right.
No,
The
it's
difference on the
98. You'd like it to be $9.80.
Okay. Thank you for that. It feels like, again, from the principles that you've outlined in the process you've gone through, there's reasonable stability. Now, I'm not asking you, by the way, right at this stage to make a decision. We'll get to that when we get to the actual resolutions. If the things that you want to change, that's good. We can entertain those at that point. Okay, I think we're into CASA now when you're ready. Thanks, Nicole.
So this is much more, overall it's quite a small activity in terms of council's overall operations, but for Stewart Island it's quite an important activity. So in terms of what's going on with that at the moment, they have been currently funding a bit of their activity from reserves, which is technically not really allowed under the policy. So we've amended the policy to allow for that funding mechanism. Plus we've been talking to them about how do they actually want to have a sustainable supply and what methods of funding are they going to propose to make up that deficit. So we've looked at some options around that, and one of the options that they're proposing is actually to introduce a rate for properties that are on the island within the network distribution area. And so that would consist of a higher rate for those properties that actually are connected to the network, and a half charge for those properties that are not connected. And that's in addition to the variable charge and fixed charges. The reason for that is largely focused on the fact that the pricing on the island, they're conscious of the pricing on the island is quite sensitive, and there's been quite a history of, in terms of the history of generation, centralised generation system was put in because of a lot of noise and pollution occurred from everybody running their own generators. So that was really the impetus for just getting a centralised distribution system put together. However, in providing that, there's quite a high level of fixed cost, and I've got Ashby here who's got that background, but it's more in terms of there's management fees associated with having people on staff on the island to run the scheme, the cost of the generators and keeping them going. All of those sorts of things make it quite a high level of fixed cost associated with running the asset. whereas the variable costs around diesel and some of the maintenance and line costs or maintenance costs we've got are there, but they're probably not to the same extent of the fixed costs. So in terms of the board's point of view, they were conscious of the balancing between charging more for electricity, which might become a disincentive to supply and cause people to disconnect from the network, seek their own alternatives, get us back to square one of having generations, pollution, all that sort of thing. So when they thought about the benefit associated with this activity, they realised that one of the benefits is that avoiding that situation, and on that basis their belief was that it was appropriate to perhaps introduce a rate to assist with the fixed component costs of the, that we've got in terms of management fees. And so they've proposed to introduce a rate for that purpose to assist with that, and to an extent keep the variable and fixed charges in check to some degree, I think I would say. So in the report I signalled that we had to do some work on whether there were any legal limitations on whether the council could or could not do a sort of rate for an electricity supply, which was an issue that Bruce raised when we were talking to him about it. And we've checked with the Electricity Commission or Electricity Authority, and those discussions have indicated there's nothing there to prohibit us from being able to charge a rate for electricity supply, particularly because CEAS is considered an island network, and so the rules that apply to everyone, the same rules don't necessarily apply to CEAS. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
You're welcome to come to the table. We're going to actually, perhaps we just treat this on a case-by-case basis. So the questions either particularly to Ashley or from Nicole over the table. Sorry? Ashby. Oh, sorry, Ashby. Got it wrong. I apologise for that.
Have the board considered or made any consideration to having some sort of incentive for people to hook up to the system? Instead of paying half, some sort of incentive that works to hook up to the system permanently, which would then also assist on generating more revenue and keeping that pollution down as well. So have it been discussed?
I think most properties on the island are connected. I think the properties that are not connected are vacant properties. So this is more probably an incentive to develop those properties and connect, I would imagine. But
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I just wanted to get quite a number that would
Yeah.
an option.
My understanding is from the exercise that we did that the majority of them are connected.
I think that you, Mr. Chair, further to the comments previously made, it's the purpose of the rate is to recognise that there may be an incentive to drop off if the variable rate increases or any other rates increase, and so it's being proactive in a sense.
Is there
But there
is there a cost to hooking up to the system?
there is a connection charge. Yes, there's a physical connection charge if you're a new property, and there is additionally an administration connection charge if you were to drop off and on.
I was thinking that's an issue.
And we have talked a little bit about the structure of those fees and whether they could be structured slightly different to disincentivise connection and disconnection on a regular basis.
Yeah.
That's something that we're looking at leading into the LTP.
Currently the disconnection charges are set up to reflect the administrative cost of connecting or disconnecting.
Okay, so there isn't essentially a lot of scope for growing the business. Per se, your costs are going to grow over time. And if I've picked up the arguments correctly, there is an argument here about the public benefit across the whole community, particularly in relationship to noise and pollution, as in, I suppose, presumably fumes, smell, whatever. And actually we are trying to recognise that aspect in this charge, which also has the effect that the rating system is being used to contribute to the overall cost of the activity, and it's not just solely based on consumption.
And part of the benefit as well that is outlined in the policy is around just the availability having of supply on the island, and what does that do in terms of ease of living and being able to service visitors and all of that. So the rate component also reflects that aspect of the activity as well.
Right. Are there any other questions for either Ashby or Nicole on the CA surcharge? One of these ones where we are looking at our rating tools and we're introducing in effect a new rate.
It is, yeah.
It's where we're actually saying the source of funding, this is back to the revenue and financing policy, the source of funding should come from a different area, which is the ratepayer rather than the consumer. Okay, good. Keep going. Thank you, Ashby. Appreciate that, man.
Okay, so Stewart Island GTs. So there's a separate paper attached in the report, but I'm just going to recap what that basically says. So this is another one where we're looking to make a change in the funding tools that are used. So we've done some work in terms of the GTs, and the level of maintenance renewal that we have programmed isn't sufficient really to maintain that asset. And we've also had the addition of Golden Bay now as well, which means that we've got some new costs which need to be funded. Now, the GTs currently are mostly funded or 100% funded from commercial users fees, and so the costs that actually to have a sustainable GT use and maintain those assets appropriately mean that the effect on those commercial users is quite high, and so we were looking at alternative funding sources to do with that. Now, this was also an issue that was raised in the Stewart Island Sustainability Review, which quite clearly instructed the Revenue and Financing Policy to take a harder look at this activity and consider whether the mix of funding that we've got right is right for this. So we've done this process and we've talked to the board a little bit about benefit, about the nature of those benefits, and we've also taken into account that size of that community and the ability of them to service the cost that we're looking at. So we had when we talked to the board and we've come back to council, we've sort of discussed about what the funding mix might be. We're looking at quite a bit of a change in here. So we're looking at introducing a local targeted rate of contribution from the community board, which could sit between 0 and 10% of the cost of the activity. The fees and charges, which is the component that's coming from the commercial users, we're looking to make that between 60 to 70% of the cost. Grants and subsidies, we're looking to secure some ongoing funding from the visitor levy to assist with this activity and funding it on an ongoing basis rather than one-off basis, and we're looking for between 0 and 20% for that. And we're looking to potentially fund a portion of this activity through the general rate between 0 and 30%. So when we spoke in the workshop around this, we were still finalising the costs of this activity, and just for your context, that work is largely now complete, and the annual costs, taking into account Golden Bay and the capital work that we need to do and the operating maintenance cost, is in the region of $132,000 per annum. So you can equate that 10% is about $13,000. So if we're saying the general rate should be between 0 and 30% at the upper end, that would be $40,000, which is around $2.50 per property in Southland. Okay. And then the local rate component at 10% would be around $27 a property. There's about 500 properties on the island, and they would be recouping $13. So whilst we've got to go through the process of agreeing the actual amounts that are going to, this policy is setting the bands in which we think is appropriate to fund these activities. And like I said, the paper in the report really talks about the rationale for that and the reasons for that, and so does the policy document, in terms of saying there is an element of public benefit to these GTs in terms of access to the conservation environment for recreational use for all of Southlanders, but predominantly it's really around the Stewart Island Sustainability Review and the ability of that small community to fund the costs associated with GT, and that is the primary mover for the policy change that we're looking at here in terms of putting in a general rate component. It's quite a departure for council, and it is very specific for this community and the issues that they face.
Thank you, Nicole. So again, very, you say, if you go back to it, this is a substantive change to your existing policy.
It's a tiny monetary amount, but
tiny monetary amount, but
yes.
it has changed the basis. So again, I'll open up questions from Nicole. Yes, John.
Yes, I just carry on that point. If we dispense with the monetary amount, there's a principle here that will not resonate with certain sections of the community. That the district should pay for something that is local and cannot afford to fund itself. So our messaging will have to be strong and consistent, because once people see if this goes through, then it could open up other communities saying, well, we've got community good, but we can't afford our local activity, therefore can we go to the district to help us?
So I think like in terms of the way it's been worded in the policy is really to try and reference how this might differ from other communities, particularly in relation to the stimulus coming through the work that was done through the Stewart Island Sustainability Review. So the pages, I'm just trying to find it. I've lost some pages in my report, but there's a section in there where we talk about water structures. When I find it. So, particularly around the rationale in there, we're talking about Stewart Island community. So we're saying that actually we're recognising that in our rationale for this activity that there is some infrastructure that places quite a large burden on small communities, and we're specifically talking about Stewart Island in there. Okay, and we recognise the fact in the other parts of the policy that there is benefit. The jetties do provide an access point and a way to get around and for recreation, but the reason and rationale for the large majority of this change is the burden that that's going to place on that small community. So you have to put that in perspective. There's 500 ratepayers, $132,000. They have no reserves, so their ability to effectively fund this themselves is very much more limited than you would find in any other community who have a larger rating base, and they don't have the same significance of water assets to fund. And on the principle and policy basis, the paper talks a little bit about those principles and policies around, around the reasons why, to try and help guide council through those pressure points and point the community to the circumstances under which we've made this decision, which is quite different. Rather than setting a precedent for other instances, we're trying to explain why this is a different case. And that was in the attachment E of the document.
Okay, Don and then Paul, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think just in addition to John's comments, yes, I acknowledge that it's a significant financial burden on a small community having 6 jetties, but I think we should also acknowledge that the rates level across the district is also pretty high at the moment. I mean, I think generally we've established that 5% is pretty much up there. So I'm just wondering if the community needs to look at whether 6 jetties is absolutely necessary to meet their needs down there.
Yeah, and I'm aware, having sat with the community board and also talking to the community partnership leader, that that's a conversation that they're having about what are the core infrastructure needs around jetties that they need, and is there a priority around that? And so, in terms of where this policy sits with those decisions, this policy is sitting a little bit outside of that because we're consulting on it in advance, but those decisions still need to be made by that board, and they do need to set some priorities, and they are having that conversation. And that's definitely a message in terms of, this is, council was very, this is a difficult issue for council in terms of providing that assistance. And in particular, you do have to consider that we've recently taken on Golden Bay, so that's an additional, quite large, substantial capital expenditure that needs to be funded. As well. So I understand the point that you're making, and that's something that council, in the discussions that we've had to weigh up in terms of saying, actually, we think that there's room for some generate funding. It's in the region of that band. We need to agree that, and we need to finalise discussions with the community board about which actual assets are going to be maintained and operate. But even with the removal of some of those assets, it'd still be around that cost most likely.
Well, if it's a vital piece of infrastructure, $27 per property doesn't seem to balance with it being such a vital piece of infrastructure.
That's
And
the
that's the running cost, is it? The
no,
maintenance cost?
that's if we charge 10% of the cost of that activity on the local rate.
Well, that's
on
the
the Stewart
district-wide
Island.
rate.
Hmm? No, that's the Stewart Island.
Yeah, okay, for the jetties.
The
Okay,
general
for-
rate, it would be the equivalent of $2.50 per property.
Yeah, so $27 per property doesn't seem to be a high cost for,
Yeah, and if they were to
That
fund that
particular-
entirely
that community.
themselves, it would be, what's 132 divided by 500? Huh?
So $27 per property.
It would be
yeah,
600.
so $27.
132,000 divided by
I
500.
think before, again, if we were to follow Nicole's advice, we have to approach this from a policy perspective, and it's a judgment call. Okay, and if you go to page 49 of your agenda, I think it's what you were referring to, Nicole, which deals with water facilities. I'm looking at the right
Yeah,
the right
I
bit?
think so.
The important part here, if I've read this correctly, is some
$280,
costs associated with, it's getting too small for my eyes. Let me start again. Some costs associated with facilities that have national district significance and provide critical transport infrastructure to the community may also be funded from the general rate. So that's a rationale that is posited behind this. So it's the degree to which, and I don't have any trouble with the questioning, Don, it's the degree to which you would want to ascribe national and district significance to this activity. I think that would be a fair point, Nicole, in terms of my direction. Your argument is that it comes to the current costs to around $40,000. Paul, you have a...
Oh, well, I was just going to sort of put the view forward that Stewart Island ratepayers pay the roading rate, and they have got a limited roading network over there, even though I guess it's costly to keep. So in some ways you could say the jetties are infrastructure similar to roading, and justifies a district element of the funding of it.
We have, by the way, looked at whether NZTA a potential source of funding for these jetties. I should know that answer because it seems paid for. No chance. They built the Wainga Wharf on Chatham Island, so...
Well, they don't get potholes.
I just throw things
They
up.
do if it's lumpy in the sea.
Yeah. Okay, so the critical point here, and Don's raised it, is what's the proportionate response? And so there is a sense, and Paul, you've raised it as well, there's a national and district value to these jetties rather than just local. So it's a judgment call, which is in your capacity to recommend as to where that sits. We have going back to it, and I think I might have said it wrong, just to remind you, $2.50 or a total of $40,000 that we're saying is district, in contrast to a local contribution, in contrast to a operator contribution. The bulk is still contributed by the operators,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
Must be by definition.
And through you, Mr Chair, this is just bad, just does it mean that as part of the LTP process, that we will set it at 30%?
That's right.
That discussion
Yes.
still potentially
Yeah.
needs to occur as part of this,
Yeah.
this topic. All we're trying to do there is give an indication of the quantum
Yes.
to which
Yeah.
you may be subject to.
So for this debate, the question is, do we agree with the, and again, it's the policy or the principle
Yeah.
that there should be, or sorry, that
The
there can
ability
be a national/district component to the funding of the jetties. Don?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I think if there was one jetty there, or two, or possibly three, then I would be comfortable saying, okay, significant. But there's six, and we're only talking about the maintenance costs, I understand. It's not replacement costs, and the jetties need replaced quite regularly. So we're talking about a pretty small number when the real one's significantly higher.
And you've indicated, Nicole, that they're doing that review at the moment in terms of what is the total need for jetties.
Yeah, that's Karen might be able to comment more on that, but yeah, that's been part of the discussions that they've been wrestling with. How do they fund?
Yes.
And the question of what do we need to review what we actually need, or what's the difficulty they've got is that they had quite an extensive consultation process that was undertaken in terms of liaising with the community about the activity. And in that consultation process, the community has indicated that most of those duties, or in fact all of those duties, are what they would like to retain. So that's the difficulty that they find themselves in as well, about navigating that situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think through Mr Chair, also Golden Bay has significantly changed this picture. You know, like before Golden Bay, potentially those commercial operators were funding those operations. Now, we have made an extra allowance in the budgets for this time round for some maintenance that previously wasn't budgeted for in that area. So I still believe those operators potentially pick up that side of it. It's very much that Golden Bay. And so, you know, part of the picture may be looking more in regards to Vista Levy or some other problems in there as well. So it could well be that we are just funding the one, which would be Golden Bay, because the operators can pick up the rest of it. We need to still work through that picture though, and we can do that as part of this LTP process. This is just, like I said before, just providing us that tool to work within a window of.
If we don't put this in, then we have no option to actually decide to do that. So putting this in this policy enables us to make a decision later on that otherwise we wouldn't be able to make. Or we would have to amend this policy in order to do that.
So
Yes, I guess.
you could set the general rate at 0.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to set it at something high, you couldn't without a change of policy now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I would also suggest that once the islanders see the sort of financial impact that you're talking about, it will focus their minds as well on 6, 5 and 4.
Yeah.
Because that will then become part of that consideration.
Yes, because
If you want 6 wards, this is what it's going to cost. If you have 4, this is what it's going to cost.
yes, whereas
So that's part of that process.
whereas before it's all been worn by the operator up there.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
pick up on what you're talking about. It's just
There'll be some discipline there. Okay, I think again, as I say, we're going to come back to the resolution, so let's not be too bound up by the process. We've had a good consideration there. There may be things you want to recommend going forward. So Nicole, you continue, please.
Yep, sure. Town Out Airport, which has got a big blank slide.
Oh,
Which I'm just going
we'll
to.
move on past that now. Nicole, it's no worry.
Sometimes it's just for me to remember what I need to talk about. In the report I indicated that subsequent to all of Council's discussions, the TNA Community Board has indicated that they were potentially looking for Council to consider some general rate funding or district-wide rate funding for their activity. In discussion with staff who have attended the meetings where they've talked about that, in terms of the reasoning for that, so they were talking, and Abel, you'll be able to join in, they were talking about, given the nature of the benefits of the airport and its importance to Southland, and in terms of its strategic importance to as an asset to the whole area, that they actually felt it was appropriate that future capital expenditure and potentially a portion or all of the operating expenditure should be wholly funded or partly funded by a district-wide rate. And the nature of those reasons was really around in terms of the whole community benefits from the airport, because it provides an alternative in terms of an alternative transport option in terms of emergency events to assist with evacuations and flooding. Its strategic importance, particularly in the future, as a potential hub for visitors and people, and as an alternative, as they're called, staging post to Queenstown and access point to Milford and Fiordland, perhaps in the longer term. And also currently that asset is indicated as a council strategic asset in the significance engagement policy, although I note that's proposed to change in the report tomorrow. But in terms of if it's of a strategic nature, then the question is around why it's really left to the local community board to fund that area. So when they've had these considerations as well, I understand is that they're talking about future CapEx and OpEx, not necessarily the costs that have been involved in obtaining developing the airport to date, which are currently being paid for by a loan that the ratepayers in that area are paying. So it's really around those future costs. In terms of what they look like, so there is some capital expenditure programs in the LTP that they've been discussing around runway resealing or rehabilitation of the runway, and they sort of are in the magnitude of 1.3 million, is it? Something like that.
Minimum.
Yeah, in the magnitude of that amount of money. And there's also some operating expenditure related as well. So, so I guess their point of view was, given that nature of that benefit, that's something that they wanted council to explore. In terms of what's in the policy at the moment, so the policy that's here at the moment is very similar to what we've got now, and that policy acknowledges the fact that primarily the benefits fit to the local community area in terms of the economic benefit and the operators that are using that airport. The policy, the existing policy does reflect that it does provide that service in terms of evacuations and a transport, alternative transport link, but it settles on the fact that actually the majority of the benefit is to that local area and therefore that should fund it. In the revision of the policy that I've done as well, I've sort of tried to tell the story a little bit better and so in the policy part you'll see that in considering the benefits to the whole community, the parts of the community and the individuals, I've indicated in there that there is a nature of benefit to the whole community between 0 to 15%. But given that council we're not funding that 0 to 15% from a general rate at the moment. So at the moment we're saying there is an element of public benefit, but we believe that actually on balance it falls mainly to that local community, and therefore they should fund that. So council hasn't an opportunity to talk about this yet. So I guess I'm just trying to get an indication of that this is something that the committee thinks that we should explore and maybe include for consultation as part of the review that we're doing. That was really, and it's just more of a verbal update, just because in terms of the timing.
So if folk want to follow this through a bit more, again it's on the same page as water facilities, which is page 49 of the agenda, and as you can see from that, Nicole has inserted the rationale that if you are prepared to accept the public good element, which is a benefit over and beyond that to local businesses and residents. You suggested there could be a range of funding in the area of 0 to 15%.
Yeah, and in saying that, the public benefit component can also be reflected in the targeted rate. So,
yes.
It's not necessarily just a general rate component.
Sorry, yes,
yeah.
Fair point. Yes, it could be both, and you've reflected that in. Actually, it's more likely to be targeted rate.
Yeah. In terms of the way that that's described.
In the way that it's described in the paper.
I think Matt
So just before I open it up to question, can I just check in terms of the business for this afternoon? This is the most open, or at least so far, this is the most open of the views that we need. What needs to be finalised tonight, Nicole?
For me, it's just, I guess, does this committee have a view to take to council about whether it's something that should be actively consulted on in this process? Okay. And if they do have a view, what's their feeling on the policy, on terms of the proportion?
Yes, yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Right, I'll open up the discussion. Yes, Paul?
Well, I certainly think it should be actively consulted on. I just wonder, my take on it so far is that because the Fiordland community's paying, if by some miracle the airport area started to make money, that benefit would go to the Fiordland community. So if the district starts to contribute, then I suppose the benefit would go to water.
Yes, John?
So, I believe that the airport represents an underutilised asset, and I would like to see a business case advanced that certainly makes it easier for private operators to operate from the airport. Currently we have restrictions around the tenure of the land that they can utilise to build their hangars and so on. And if somehow we could come up with a plan that involved council, operators, locals, I believe there's huge potential in that asset. So that's sort of at the higher level. It's not at the rating level, but it's just recognising that there is, it's a great site, the buildings that are there are fabulous, but it's still way underutilised in the
Okay, yes, Don.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not too familiar actually with the history of how we ended up with an airport there, but I gather it was a Te Anau community initiative. That's why they're paying for it. And I guess if we looked at the facts, it's, well, you can't call it an asset, it's a liability at the moment because it's costing us money. At the moment it's costing the Te Anau ratepayer money, so effectively the Te Anau ratepayer wants the district to support them with a money-losing venture. So this is, it's like the can of worms with the jetties and now the airport, and then it's just potentially, you know, there's the potential for every community to come to the council for a handout. So as far as the evacuation emergency goes, I mean, helicopters don't need an airport to land, they land on a lawn.
So
Yeah,
just in
I'll
terms
just-
of providing some context around the differences with Stuart Island, just I think it's important to get that quite straight, and it really is around that burden issue. So Te Anau they do have a larger rating base, they do have some reserves, you know, so they're not in the same situation in terms of the sustainability of that service. So that's how it sort of differentiates itself from Stuart. I just think it's worth pointing it out in terms of the policy.
I would agree with that but
Yeah.
in Stuart Island there's 6 jetties.
Yeah.
If they'd been through a process and figured out, oh okay, well maybe we just need 3 would be nice. So then I think that argument would have more legs. But it seems like a lot of jetties for a small community.
Okay.
Just building on to comments that John made, and also Paul, the North opportunities is certainly indicating that the airport would be quite beneficial to the entire district, South District. There's potentially some significant changes in Norfolk itself, so the future of the airport will be quite strategically important for South District. The Great South has also indicated their view on the airport as well, saying that's a strategic asset, should be well utilised. It's underutilised, so we've got 2 organisations that are really saying we really need to keep that particular airport and have it as a strategic asset. The Fuel Community Board have also indicated that the community also sees that as a strategic asset for the airport, not just fuel but wider as well. And then you've got your emergency management, and you're right on, helicopters land anyway, but when we evacuated just on 300 people to recuperate, it was just what helicopters that were fixed in planes to get around China. So if you start looking at the bigger picture, which I think we need to, that there are some real opportunities. We have in the past looked at the airport, I think there's been either 3 or 4 business cases, there's been at least 4 different options looked at that airport, and I won't go into the reasons as to why they didn't proceed. But hence to say there's some really good ideas to take that airport forward, commercially, also for private handlers and private operators. But there were some restrictions at that time that created some hurdles that we couldn't overcome at that time. Those hurdles have been removed, and now there's a great opportunity for that airport. We just need to get some direction, we need to get some input, council, as well as the community are now saying, well, there is that benefit for the wider district, not just for Fulham. And that's why they're looking at it as a district-wide rate. To note that the fuel and community will continue to pay off the loan, 1.4 million. That's still to be paid, and the community will continue to pay that loan. Their debt. That's certainly not walking away from me. So just want to put that in context as well. So I would hope that this community would support the idea that we have a district for support with regards to capital and OpEx costs.
Yes, Don?
Oh well, I mean it's cost money, cost the Te Aneo ratepayers money. It's costing money. Upgrade the airport's going to be a lot more money. 3 business cases. Not every town can have an airport just for evacuations and flooding.
What would you suggest, Don?
Well, it's might be like the old story: if you find yourself in a hole, you stop digging.
So
So
would
you're-
you suggest that we mothball the airport?
Well, if it's got all this potential that you're talking about, Great South, Milford opportunities, then great, get involved. But I'm a bit sceptical that there's a big benefit for the community to take on, the wider district to take on the debt, the cost of maintaining this.
I think we need to show some
Negative
leadership. Now's the time.
Well, I am.
Now's the time to show leadership
no.
that we support that. That we support Great South School and welfare opportunities. We've got these organisations saying, here's a benefit for long term. We need to be in that same mindset. Very mindset.
Julie, you've got a point.
Yes, I think that as a council we need to be seen to be more nimble than what we have been in the past. And putting this out for consultation and signalling that it is a possibility, we're not saying that we are doing it, gives us some flexibility that 3 years is a long time in this world now until we can review this again. And so I think that it just gives us opportunities to move in a way that if the opportunities present itself. So there is an insurance policy more than anything.
Julie? Paul?
I think I might have mentioned that before here, but I think the reason that we ended up with the airport was it was valued at 18 million and we were able to procure it for 6. So it was seen then as worth taking on. But I think the important thing is that this is actually going out for consultation. We're not making a decision about it today. And we're giving the community as a whole an opportunity to inform us better and make their views known. I think we'd be unwise not to take that opportunity to put it out for that. There's been enough talk about it behind the scenes over the time, and this sort of brings it out in the open.
Thank you for that, Paul. Gary?
Exactly what I was going to say, that this has still got to go out for consultation. The 4th of December we'll know what's coming from this, and to take it off the table, I think that's the wrong thing to do.
Certainly.
Ms Robson certainly mentioned in regards to Golden Bay, just to go back up the bus a bit, that's the reason why those figures are so high. The Stewart Island community are going to look at the assets they've got and prioritise. We've got a significant asset in Te Aneo that needs to be addressed. It's been commented here before. We do need to be nimble as a council, and we need to take this forward. So the only way to do that is through our long-term process and wait for communities to come back. I'm looking forward to the 4th of December.
It's interesting because I take your point, Julie, that it's keeping nimbleness in because you might, it's again for public input 0 to 15. So I would certainly agree with your views, John, that actually we're sensing the prospects. We'd like to see what the business, how do we maximise its potential, and that'll come through as we deal with things like MOC and other matters, which Great South, sorry, that's one of the Great South, which may give a bit of sense of actually how it's of value both to the local community but also district-wide, which would say, well, actually we've got this mechanism in place. Rightio. Okay. So and then the final bit of wisdom that you both share is that let's remember this is consultation territory at the moment. We're not making a final decision. Okay. Can I?
Mr. Chair, I think we do just need to confirm one thing though, because currently the policy is just saying 0 to 15 for a target rate. So it's not saying general rate here.
Sorry. Yes. Did I say general rate?
No. So that's why I'm just checking, because the targeted rate potentially, is there going to be a targeted rate across the district? Or is that going to be just a targeted rate for the community?
So is that rate changing part of this?
That's
0
part
to
of that,
15?
that
It's
would be
going
the
to.
funding source for the policy.
So the way that the
This is
table,
consultation.
the way that the table works is we're saying that there's between 0 and 50% public benefit in terms of generally to the whole community and also to when we think about public benefit to the people in TNL. So, and then in terms of private benefit, we're saying actually we're also reflecting that there's actually more of a benefit in that particular area, and the majority of it is in that space. And then we go on to say, so based on that sort of thinking and our rationale, we've currently got between 0 and 33% of the activity is funded through targeted rates. So that's what medium means, under targeted rates. So if we were looking to allow for a general rate input, I would be looking to add general rate as a funding source, and I'd be looking to indicate what proportion that would be. And if it was, medium is, that's 33 to 67% of the cost, I'd probably be looking to put low in there to reflect the fact that we've got public benefit around 0 to 15%. And it would be, so the funding source would be adding in general rate and indicating that a low amount from the general rate would be based on that discussion.
So that's what you need a decision on today,
Yeah.
or a lead from.
An endorsement
from
that that's what you would suggest to
that's what
council.
we would be suggesting to council
Yeah.
as they consider to go consult on. Okay. So thank you. That would be in addition to the target. So that's in addition to the target rate would be a general rate contribution, and you're suggesting at the low end, which is 0 to 15.
Yeah, well, it's actually 0 to 33% the way those bands are devised. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's keep that in mind as we keep going. So, what's next?
So we're on to waste management.
Yeah.
We're jumping a bit around. So just in terms of, on paragraph 54 on page 29. So currently, in terms of waste management, we set a separate targeted rate for waste management, and that is used to fund part of the cost of transfer stations, recycling drop-off centres, green waste sites, as well as a bit of waste minimisation activity. In the discussions that we had, we talked about the fact that is there a need for a targeted rate for this activity? It's got quite a high level of general benefit and public benefit. We could fund that through the general rate. So we get to that consideration of, do we need to have that shown separately for transparency and accountability? And council's discussion around that was that it actually doesn't need to be a separate rate. And in fact, the comment that I made at the workshop was actually a lot of people find that confusing, the waste management rate. They confuse it with the wheelie bin, and so it actually creates quite a bit of confusion being a separate rate. So the recommendation was simply just to change the tool to the general rate. The basis that it will be collected is the same. It's currently both the general rate and the waste management rate are set between a capital value and a uniform annual general charge portion, and the relativity between those two is actually really consistent. So it's going to have very negligible effect on people's rates. It's just simply around, we don't really necessarily need it to show that activity because it's got high level of public benefit, access to everyone to those services, and it's funded in a consistent manner to the general rate. So the change was really just moving it from a targeted rate to a general rate.
Which also provides some flexibility as well, doesn't it? Doing a general rate. Yeah. Okay. Comments for Nicole? Go on. I think you were.
Sorry, this move, does that mean that we can't see what's that activity gets bundled into another set of numbers?
So generally speaking, when we do the rates notice, the first one for the year, we do attempt to break that back out so that even though we've got a one line that says the general rate, CV, and the general rate UAGC, we provide some supplementary information to explain what's in there. And we're also talking to the rates team about putting together some online videos and things like that that explain in more detail around what's making up that general rate to adjust for the fact that you're talking about, so people actually understand what's in there. The difficulty at the moment is in the way that it's described. People don't understand it anyway at the moment, so if we can explain that in a different way.
I think there are two things here I could help Nicole that are relevant to keep in mind. There is not a loss of cost in providing this activity. We'll still have the cost of providing waste minimisation activities within the district. The efficiency that we're seeking to gain through this is that because the nature of the activity is one which is akin to what you would do through a general rate, you're being efficient in terms of using one mechanism for a number of activities. As a separate rate, I mean, it's right, is a targeted rate, dare I say it, that's less efficient. There's limited administrative value, in fact there's a cost in having a district-wide target rate for waste management which stands alone, as in contrast to just being collected through the general rate, which again just reflects the imposition of the liability that you expect under the target rate anyway. So it's about being efficient, administratively efficient, what is a virtue.
Right. So potentially it could be bundled up with the same number as the Queenstown, the Manapuri Airport.
Well, that yes, if we chose to consult on a district-wide input to the county airport, the answer is yes. But I think that the point that perhaps you started in Nicole's making is the importance, even though we recognise the similarity of, or rather we use the same funding mechanism for a number of activities, it's important on the rates assessment notice and also another communication that we are clear what the general rate is covering, because it's going to be covering, it does now, and it will continue to cover a lot of different activities. We need to be clear, we need to be clear it picks up this waste minimisation. Great other comments from the side of the table? Anybody want to raise anything here?
I know, well, I don't mind as long as people are informed of
Yes.
what they're paying for.
No, your point.
Yeah.
Good point. Yes, communication becomes really important. Yeah, no, I understand that. Like the idea of the videos on the website, that'd be great. We'll have to work out which council stars on it. Who's going to star on it, Louise? Okay. Well, that seems like I think that we've exhausted that part of the discussion. What's next, Nicole?
So wastewater is just to highlight that
That's
actually
right.
through
Thank
this
you.
process we did consider whether we've got the way that we currently fund wastewater right, and whether we need to make changes to the way we rate. So we currently do that in terms of full charge for residential property, and we have a half charge for vacant property, and then we have a full charge for other properties that have more than one PM. So we went through different scenarios about what that would look like if we changed that, but council settled back in terms of the nature of the benefit. They're comfortable with what they've got in terms of those Section 1013 analyses of the way we currently do it, but it was something that we actively considered during this process, so it's just sort of highlighting that. So there's no change recommended there, it's just to point out that that was one of the
Yes,
areas that we looked at.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So again, I mean, it's being dispensed with. You're retaining your existing policy, but it does ultimately, in an odd way, still form part of your, well, in an odd way, it still forms part of your revenue and financing policy. Anybody want to raise questions or comments on that? We're keeping it the way it is. We haven't seen a need to move from the status quo.
Yeah. Cool. So it's just for information.
Right. So I do have an eye both to your time, but more important to the resolution. And we haven't quite finished all the business that will be required to pass this resolution. But if I could just refer you to it, that firstly C, something that we received the report makes sense. B, that we are meeting our responsibilities under the Act. That's both in B and C. And obviously we're also reflecting on this under F that we want to go to consultation anyway, so that's probably meeting our biggest risk and obligations. So we firstly consider the draft revenue and financing policy and rating review and provide feedback. This is where I'd just like to check out of the discussion, the direct discussion that Nicole has taken us through. Is there any feedback we need to incorporate into this resolution as we look at the totality of the revenue and financing policy? We've looked at about a number of rates. We've got some comments. Are there any adjustments to those that people believe we need to include in the resolution? I think the obvious one is, do we want to include the consultation around the use of the general rate for the Te Anau Airport? Okay. Bear in mind we're doing here with going to consultation. This is not a definitive decision by any stretch of the imagination. Do I have the general consensus that we add the general rate as being consulted on in terms of Te Anau Airport? Not from you, Don? Have I got it broad?
Oh, sorry, you're asking.
I'm
you
asking,
want
I'm
to
asking, in
consult-
terms of D, we were asked to provide feedback. I believe if we want to change things, we need to acknowledge that actually we are agreeing to consideration and consultation on a general rate input to Tiana Wastewater. Sorry, Tiana Wastewater. According to sorry.
The answer
You're
is
able, I
no.
apologise. To Tiana Airport. That was a nightmare, wasn't it? Sorry. Okay.
Is it better? Does it really matter?
Well, I'm open. Which do you need from us, Nicole?
Would that confuse things out there, Mr. Chairman? I'm just wondering.
Well, they're looking for guidance.
So, yeah, so currently the policy does not allow for any funding for the airport from general rate. Okay,
Right.
so it's not in there. So if the committee thinks that that should be amended and that council should consider that amendment, then I'd be looking for you to specifically state that that's an amendment that you would be looking for.
So this is feedback to the council meeting tomorrow, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So look, I'm just getting some advice here on actually how we would incorporate this into the resolution from Fiona, but it would actually be that we would note a suggested amendment to include use of the general rate to part fund the Tiana Airport. Okay? I think there's a general consensus. We'll try and do this without having to go through too many different motions. Is there anything else in terms of what we have discussed this afternoon that we would be asking the council to consider as it goes out to consultation? I haven't seen anything at this stage. Just to remind, we have had the local board activity, which is generally I think has been accepted based on it. There's CIASA, which I think we have accepted with where that's going. There's not actually a direct need for guidance that's been incorporated, but that's actually in effect, let's remember the use of a part charge by way of a fixed targeted rate. And again, it's differentiated between connections and availability in effect, but nobody seemed to be suggesting in that there would be a change. We've had the Stewart Island jetties, which again is a reflection that we would look to use to create a policy change to use some level, and I've forgotten the percentage, sorry, of district-wide funding for that. Correct? Nicole? Nobody's necessarily said that. We've had some discussion around the rationalisation process, and we've heard some encouragement for that. But that's again, I think a slightly different aspect. Tiana Airport, we're going to have the addition that we consider the policy consults on use of the general rate, and with waste, we have basically nobody seems to have gone against what's recommended in the paper that actually that be treated as a not treated as a general rate, it be part of the general rate. And we've had the discussion around communication. So the only amendment that I have really picked up at this stage is that for consultation we include the use of the general rate in terms of the Tiana Airport. Yeah, we'll come back to the total thing, because I think there's still one piece of business we've got to transact for you, which is actually the overall revenue and financing policy as a whole. So if you go, can you just refer us to the right page in the pages, please, Nicole?
So the policy itself starts on page number, I turned it over and I didn't need to, 34, and it runs through to page 57 of the agenda.
So the only thing about it that is not consistent with where we've got tonight is around the Tiana Airport. We've asked Nicole to include, particularly in relationship to funding sources and the way it would go, which is all the tables at the back with the general rate be are considered as part of that. Otherwise, we're looking at a revenue and financing policy consistent with Nicole's paper, which is broadly going back to it all consistent with the existing revenue and financing policy. Bear in mind, we start off looking at the local board rates, which is $4.2 million, and your total $56 million spend on last year's numbers. And then the rest we spent more time on, which are relatively, I would say, modest rates, but have a couple of tweaks, well, one tweak actually, that we're wanting, but actually the rest are basically tweaks without trying to dismiss that. Are there any comments folk would like to raise at this point about the revenue and financing policy itself?
Just I was going to just point out, sorry I should have done that earlier, is that the activity funding, and so the start of the policy talks about how council's generally going to approach its funding and using this benefit thinking in terms of public benefit versus private benefit, and then the table sections actually go into the specific consideration of that for each activity, where we're specifically looking at all those legislative components that I had on the slide in terms of assessment of benefits, about who's creating the need, about the period of the benefit, about the costs and benefits of separate funding, and then assessing that public benefit and detailing council's rationale for where it's going to land in terms of funding, and then the indicative funding source. So it's meant to take you through those legislative requirements in a logical fashion to get to the end. Just in terms of the storytelling, I said that was one of the objectives of the change in the policy, was to show that storytelling more, succinct, more clearly.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So this is demonstrating the revenue finance policy. My vernacular is who pays what, when, and why. You're just giving a simple story about those answering those questions. Okay,
Just
Paul.
one thing I picked up, a question, and it's about a word, and it's on page 43 in the rationale to do with the community housing. And it says that they're largely funded from fees, reads in brackets, as users are easily identifiable and excludable. What are we meaning by excludable?
It means that if someone's in the house, someone else can't live in the house. Okay, so you can only have one user of it at a time in the unit.
It becomes a benefit only possible by the occupier.
Yeah. So it means it's highly more of a private benefit because it's not one person's use consumes it and it's not available for someone else. So that's what I mean by excludable. I can change it if you want me to.
Excludable is one of those great public sector words that we use around the
Right.
place. So I'm glad you read the policy, well done, buddy.
I had to look through to find a word that I could bring up.
Have you got one, John?
The one that I looked at was annual value.
Not really.
And I did look it up.
Oh, you could, so annual value for rats?
Yes.
Yes, okay. You're comfortable, we understand what that is now?
So it is basically the rental value that could be attributable to that land.
Yes, and it's assessed. There are probably a small number of local authorities that use that as a basis for rating, as in contrast to land value or capital value. It's one of the three big bases for particularly general rate.
And just as another general question, why do we still continue to use land value in certain areas in our rating? Why is it not on the capital value, which is much more easily understood by the general public?
So under a currently new policy, we won't be using land value. So we only use it currently for the ward rate, which we're now going to get rid of. So we will be, and for all purposes, be using capital value and fixed charges for our rating. So no land
Reference to
value.
land value.
No land value.
Well done. Fully support that.
Well, that sounds good. That sounds like a ringing endorsement, John. So, brilliant. Are there any other comments on the revenue and financing policy? So, look, sorry, just for my benefit, this goes to Councillor Romero, does it?
Yes.
Right, okay. So there's a wee bit of a change there. If we pass this resolution, there's a wee bit of a change there we need to rock into. You do get a chance to, again, look at it overnight and read it if you want to. Then it goes to consultation
In November.
in
start of
November, which is your month. This is why you go back to your 4th of December and get the feedback. Okay, that's good. So there are again multiple chances to revisit the adequacy of the revenue and financing policy right up until the decision at the end of the year, which becomes useful.
Just through you, Mr. Chair, I did have a request from the communications manager just about changing a word in resolution F. Oh no, just
Right.
from consultation to engagement, if that
Oh,
would
okay.
be
I like the
for
word
me.
engagement. I reckon that's really good. Okay. starts with E, it's like excludable for. So there we go, it's good. Let's have a crack. So A, we know. B, we know. Fiona, I need the concentration here. Oh, you've got it up. Oh, there, you've got it up here. Impressive. C, we are comfortable, we can tick off. D, we can tick off that we consider the draft revenue. Shouldn't we be saying we have considered? No, it doesn't matter. I'm just worried about the tense. But the Finance Committee has considered the draft revenue and provided feedback. Okay. So we endorse the draft revenue and financing policy and the rating review with the following additions. Thank you. Inclusion of consultation on the, I can't read that from up here, on the usage of the general rate to part fund Te Anau Airport. Is that adequate for your purposes?
Yeah, for my purposes, I'm going to do general rate low and brackets
Yes.
would be good.
Okay, well, actually, can we put that in there low? Because I noticed that's part of the
Yeah.
one of your key tables. Could we just have in brackets low after general rate, please?
Should it be part fund capital expenditure at Te Anau Airport to define that more? Or is it
Well, I think we were leaving it open. I mean, let me check. We were leaving it open because
Oh,
of
right.
the way I read it, it could well also be OPEX.
okay? Right.
So I think that's part of the ongoing part
But
of it,
it excludes the loan.
but it excludes the line.
And I potentially also suggest that we just say potentially part fund.
Is it a part?
And that's still going, I know it's going in consultation.
Yeah, to allow for
To allow for, there we go. Thank you.
to allow for the part funding of the
To
town.
allow for the part funding
If we're going up for public,
of the Te Anau Airport.
public engagement,
To allow for
Should
the
it
part
not be
funding
engagement
of
up
the Te Anau Airport. You right, Lee? And I think we've got, and we have got engagement. We've now got engagement of it. Is that,
you can't
is that
have one, not the other.
Oh, okay, including amendments agreed at this meeting
In the above.
in E above. So we're just making certain that the F picks up what we have agreed to, or what we may agree to in E.
Fiona, take out the between for and the part, wouldn't you? Allow for part funding of the Te Anau Airport, not allow for the part funding the Te Anau Airport.
Thank you, like efficiency. Gary, well done, mate.
Through you, Mr. Chair, can I just question the word engagement? Section 82 of the Act says it's about, under the principles of consultation, we are undertaking this process. So the Act talks about consultation that a local government undertakes in relation to any decision. The Act talks about consultation.
Yes, and we often talk about consultation and engagement. So I think probably we have to use both words at the very least. Okay, let's not get ourselves offside with the Act. Consultation, yes. Sorry, Louise, not right. I like the idea of engagement because it's about actually that honest, authentic discussion with your community, which I think is embodied, but that's fine, we can leave it that way. Right, we have, I think, got ourselves to a workable motion. Is there somebody prepared to move that motion? I'd like to suggest as a whole. Thank you. John, seconded. Is there any discussion on the motion before I put it as a whole? There isn't. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? It's carried. Thank you very much. Right, I have a feeling, unless Fiona, I'm not allowed to, that I could declare the meeting closed.
You can definitely do
Yeah, okay, that feels like a unanimous decision. So thank you for that. That's a really important meeting and discussion to have.